I don't hear anything.
All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and happy International Biodiversity Day to you all. On behalf of UN Water and CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar entitled From Agreement to Action, the Central Role of Water to Build Back Biodiversity. My name is Liz Mullen-Bernhardt. I'm joining you from beautiful Nairobi, Kenya, where the UN Environment Program houses our Global Freshwater Ecosystems Unit. Please feel free to drop a line into the chat to let us know where in the world you are joining us from so that we can say hi to you. Wherever in the world you're located, I trust we're all here for the same reason, which is to help take much needed action for our water and the biodiversity that it provides. It has now been almost exactly 2 months since the ambitious Water Action Agenda was put into place at the end of the historic UN 2023 Water Conference at General Assembly in New York. That agenda made an important recognition of the critical role of water ecosystems and their biodiversity. It has been almost exactly 5 months since countries adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework, with inland waters specifically mentioned in 2 of the targets and essential for meeting all of them. And we are nearly 8 years, more than halfway through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in which SDG 6 on water and sanitation is explicitly included and unfortunately far off track. Within SDG 6, Target 6 aims to protect and restore freshwater ecosystems, which UNEP is proud to help countries monitor together with the Ramsar Convention. This target is linked to the Global Biodiversity Framework, which has now been put into place and is central to fighting our battle against the loss of freshwater biodiversity worldwide. We're about to learn more about SDG 6 and ways to accelerate its implementation at its review coming up this July at the High Level Political Forum in New York. And all of this is happening amidst a backdrop of already historic droughts throughout Southern Europe, the Western United States, and many other places in the world. All of this means that there's never been a more critical or opportune time for water and biodiversity to come together. So the question remains, what are we going to do about it? How will we take advantage of this momentum to finally protect and restore our life-giving ecosystems and the biodiversity that depend on them? Together with all of you in this webinar today, I'm looking forward to finding out more in the next hour during our discussion with our amazing speakers and panelists. I would like to thank, and I'm honored that we'll be joined by Mr. Henk Ovink, Special Envoy for International Water Affairs of the Netherlands, and Sherpa for the UN 2023 Water Conference, to give us some scene-setting opening remarks for this webinar. We'll then have a keynote by Mr. Wataru Suzuki, Principal Coordination Officer of the Office of the Executive Secretary at the Convention on Biological Diversity. Then I'll introduce and open up to our panel discussion to talk about a few of their specific and bold commitments in the Water Action Agenda and how these will help us achieve our water, development, and biodiversity goals. We only have 1 hour together today, so I will ask everyone to please keep to time to allow for a good discussion. And for everyone in the audience, please do drop your questions into the chat and tell us who it's directed to so that we can get to as many of your questions as possible later on in the program. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand the microphone over to Henk for our opening remarks. Henk, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks so much all for joining. And I couldn't agree more. A happy Biodiversity Day, but also couldn't agree more that happy would be like perhaps the not the best way to position where we are currently at the world. Coming from the UN 2023 Water Conference, this once in a generational opportunity. Also showed us that water is so much part and parcel of everything we value and biodiversity, our ecosystems, our environment, our nature, come first and foremost, because they are part of human resiliency, our human culture, our economy. The Netherlands, together with Tajikistan, were co-hosts for this once-in-a-generation conference, showcasing not only how we lag behind on water security, sustainability, and resiliency, but also the difference in the world when it comes to how we deal with a vital resource, water, and the rest. There is a Kunming agreement, a Montreal Kunming agreement. There, where last week we just had the Sendai framework midterm review. We have a climate process. And of course, we're very happy to see water in its widest sense being addressed in the Kunming Montreal framework in target 2, 3, and 11, really emphasizing the critical role between biodiversity and water and setting a goal. But on water, there is nothing. There literally is not even a person, let alone an office or a framework to relate to that you can call. You can't say, we have SDG 6 as one of the 17 SDGs. And in its limited capacity, we definitely lag behind. But a framework cutting across everything that we value, where water plays such a critical role, being it our health and human rights, our economies, and the interlinkages between water and energy, water and food, water and cities and infrastructure and investment. The many linkages between water and climate, and then knowing that the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh was the first time that water played a sliver part, you could say, in the outcome, in the cover text, a bit on adaptation. While we drafted text on water and mitigation and biodiversity, so critical, important for achieving the goals that we set in 2015, it was all taken out by the negotiators, saying, no, it's too complex. Well, water is the solution space for making these interlinkages. That too complex is exactly showing the lock-in that we face in our society. Overcoming that lock-in will be of critical importance if we want to achieve our goals. If we want to achieve the goals set in the Kunming Montreal framework, as in the other frameworks from Sendai to COP to others. And I think, yes, the interlinkages between water and biodiversity are clear as a whole. And yes, we totally undervalue the way how to get there. So the next steps on the agenda for the world are going to be of critical importance in how we're going to support whatever needs to be done. And there is a challenge that's coming out of this water conference. We said there's a SDG summit in September. There's, of course, again, a climate conference in the fall, in November, December. And then next year, the Summit of the Future, as key moments to take stock. And at the same time, we know the CBD process will be of critical importance in seeing how we achieve UNEP's, what is it, number 6, I think.
6, yeah.
A session of the assembly next year is going to be helpful. So we will have to use all of those moments that we already agreed upon to also spur action when it comes to water security, because it really underpins everything we value and want to achieve. And at the same time, and this is new and not agreed upon, at the same time, I believe that without a strong agreement on water, in whatever capacity, and capacity at the UN, beyond UN water, as a coordination mechanism, real capacity and leadership, and a process intergovernmentally with stakeholders and across all sectors and silos, we will not turn the tide on water security. And we're way into a water insecure world. We put the water cycle out of balance, and that out of balance water cycle beyond what we normally set there. So freshwater availability going down, more polluted, becoming more saline, our sea levels are rising, we pollute our groundwaters, our rivers, our oceans, our seas. And at the same time, because of exactly biodiversity loss, land degradation, the way of bad infrastructure planning, and on top of that, exacerbated climate change, we see now atmospheric rivers impacting our world, our economies beyond continents. So the Global Commission on the Economics on Water that we installed a year ago as the government of the Netherlands concluded that this out of cycle water balance has to be restored, and the water cycle has to be seen as a global common good. That in itself is not enough, but it's going to be helpful. So there's a lot of work in these interlinkages, and there's no clear process when it comes to water. So we're totally dependent on the rest of the world, including you, to make sure that we can also deliver on the goals we set and the targets we want to achieve. But I'm more and more convinced, I was not so much, but I'm more and more convinced that we need a true water or water security, sustainability, and inclusion process. Because without that, as I currently see it, there is no trajectory, there is no pathway, so there's nothing to relate to. So water is one of the key resources that we have to value, is left alone coming after this UN conference. So look forward to the discussion. Really depend on all of you to take this to a next level and a step further. And do know that from the government of the Netherlands and our many partners, we stand ready to work with you to strengthen this water agenda, not for itself, but exactly for underpinning the achievements and accelerating the goals that we have set also for the Kunming-Montreal framework. Thank you. I'll keep it at this and look forward to the follow-up.
Henk, thank you so much, not only for the leadership of the government of the Netherlands, but for your personal, tireless commitment to the water agenda. We are very grateful, and I'm very glad you could join us today. It's my pleasure to hand over from one leader to the next leader and to welcome Dr. Musanda Mumba, the Executive Secretary of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, who is joining us in the webinar today, also for a few opening remarks. Musanda, I will hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you so very much. Can you hear me?
We hear you, yes. Thank you, Musanda.
No, fantastic. I mean, I will not take up much time because Henk has really set the scene so wonderfully. Greetings, colleagues from Nairobi. I've just been in the region where I visited Uganda. I came through to Kigali and arriving here in Kenya, where we've seen a cocktail and changes of dynamics that very much relate to the subject that we're talking about. There's been droughts, there's been floods that have literally cut off road systems in Uganda, where we begin to see how the degradation of wetland ecosystems has implications not only on the social fabric of a society or the biodiversity loss, but also on our economies and very much on our livelihoods. And we begin to see the intersectional element and also how cross-cutting the issue of water is. Henk and I had the opportunity, together with Liz and many others on this webinar, to meet in New York. And it is true that we do require a specific type of leadership and also direction that is not only future fit, that is also relevant very much to the very sustainability that we talk about within the elements of the global biodiversity framework and other MEA-related and biodiversity issues. Happy International Biodiversity Day. And it just also happens that, you know, the world is also meeting in Paris to discuss this very crisis of plastics that are affecting our biological diversity. So we begin to see how the intersectional nature of our water systems, of our wetland systems is so relevant to many facets of our society and very much to the SDGs. As we look to the future, we'll be all meeting in New York to look at SDG 6.61, looking at elements of extent. We're seeing crisis in Europe, in Spain, in one of our most iconic wetland systems and Ramsar sites, the Doñana system, where we've seen droughts. We're seeing fires in many regions that have started in January, that normally happen around the summer. Something has changed within our planetary crisis. So really in encouraging you as we go forward, how do we discuss in a very solution-orientated way? How do we collaborate differently and very strategically, especially around our freshwater ecosystems and in particular our wetland systems? As there is a convention, even as we do the reporting mechanisms, our inventories, we cannot do this outside of several partnerships within the house here. We cannot do this without the science, the data, without information that is meaningful for countries to be able to make decisions, be it for the Global Biodiversity Framework, be it for the NDCs, be it for NBSAPs, name the processes. All of that is interlinked. And water is that cross-sectoral issue that really cuts across all of these issues. So I'm very excited and looking forward to the discussions in this hour and just really wishing all the colleagues, fantastic discussions, but really let's look to the solutions to the future on how we really create a future that is different, a future that is obviously not one that we're experiencing right now, and a future that has least crisis and better for both people and nature. Thank you so much, Liz, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Musonda. Thank you, Musonda and Henk, to you both for transferring and encouraging your leadership onto all of us. We all need to step up now for water, and we're ready to answer that call. Thank you so much for your scene-setting remarks and for joining us today. It is now my pleasure to hand over to my colleague, Mr. Wataru Suzuki at the Convention on Biological Diversity, to provide a keynote on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Wataru, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liz, for your kind introduction. Dear distinguished speakers and participants, it is a great honor for me to be here, exchanging information on the interlinkages between biodiversity and water. I will try to build on the excellent scene set by Henk and Musonda, and let me share my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So again, today is a special day, the International Day for Biodiversity. The theme of this year is From Agreement to Action, Build Back Biodiversity. So I'd like to give you an overview of the new Global Biodiversity Framework from the water's perspective. Biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. These trends are also pronounced in water-related ecosystems. In 2020, the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, or GBO5, provided some possible pathways to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. Last December, countries adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, which is basically kept from the previous strategic plan. And the mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and to put nature on a path to recovery by 2030. The framework has 4 goals and 23 targets. It aims to drive urgent and transformative action by the whole of society, by governments of all levels. Today, I would like to focus to some targets relevant to water. Target 1 is to ensure that all areas are under participatory and effective management process. The framework also has 2 targets that include explicitly the wording inland water. The target 2, 30% of degraded areas are under effective restoration. Target 3 is about area-based conservation. 30% of inland waters, terrestrial, coastal, and marine areas are effectively conserved. Other relevant targets are Target 6, about invasive alien species. Target 7 is about pollution. We need to reduce the risks of all sources of pollution, including chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and plastic pollution. Target 8 is about the impact of climate change. Target 10 is on the areas used for production purposes, where we could often find competitions or trade-offs over water resources and uses. We have other closely related targets, such as Target 11 on nature's contributions to people, and Target 12 on quality and connectivity of green and blue spaces, for example. However, I should say that all targets are interrelated and relevant to water issues. Therefore, I'd like to invite you to visit the CBD website for more information on the global framework, including the 23 target, as well as GBO5 report. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I wish you all further fruitful exchanges and wonderful Biodiversity Day. Thank you. So back to you, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wataru, for that very informative intervention. And congratulations again on the passing of the Kunming-Montreal framework. It is now time for us to move to our esteemed panelists. And please, I'd like to give a kind reminder to all participants online. Don't forget to put your question into the chat, and we'll get to it after our first questions. If I could ask everyone in the panel to kindly turn on their camera. And I'll say that I'm very pleased to have on today's panel Ms. Dagmar Kaljarico, Policy Officer at the European Commission's Directorate General for Environment, as well as Mr. Ian Harrison, Freshwater Specialist at Conservation International, and Ms. Priyanka Pandey, Communications Coordinator at the Global Youth Biodiversity Network's Nepal chapter. Let me just check one more time with my co-hosts that our fourth panelist is not with us at the moment. Can someone please let me know?
He is not with us at the moment.
He's not with us. If he arrives, I will introduce him as well. But for the first part, it's my pleasure to hand over to Dagmar. And Dagmar, I'd love if you could tell us about the European Commission's commitment on valuing water and restoring ecosystems. And you have about 2 minutes for the first round. Over to you, Dagmar.
Thank you very much, Liz, and good afternoon to everybody, and happy International Day for Biodiversity. And also thank you very much for setting the scene so well. So I will go directly into the commitments, because I think I do not need to repeat how important it is to address water and biodiversity nexus. All the important things have been said. So without addressing nature and conservation protection of nature, we cannot have sound water management, and the other way around. So therefore, the EU came forward with commitments for the water action agenda. And these commitments, they relate mainly to significantly increase the rate of restoration of rivers in line with the objectives of the Water Framework Directive, and also as a part of the EU Comprehensive Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 that was adopted in May 2020. The second commitment relates also to working together with UNEP on a replicable and scalable comprehensive management approach to restore and reconnect watersheds, including rivers, lakes, wetlands, and other surface and groundwater ecosystems. What it means to restore ecosystems in the EU in line with the WFD, I don't have enough time to talk about the directive, but just to mention key elements. This legislation introduced really an integrated approach to the protection of aquatic ecosystems, taking into account all different uses and users in a watershed, in a river basin. And the main objective is really to make sure that our water bodies in the EU are in good health, in good shape, so they are able to deliver the services that we rely on. So good quality water in sufficient quantities. The biodiversity strategy goes a little bit further because it establishes concrete objectives on protecting and restoring ecosystems, including also a goal on addressing connectivity of rivers, so to make sure that we have free-flowing rivers in the EU. And the biodiversity strategy in this way reinforces the commitments under the Water Framework Directive and also under the Birds and Habitats Directive in the EU. This way, we are trying really to address the biodiversity loss and sustainable water management in the EU. And at the global level, as I mentioned, we are going to work with UNEP together to, in fact, promote a little bit and to help the countries to establish this integrated approach to water management and to protecting nature. And we are hoping that we will be starting this very soon. Thank you. I would stop here.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. And we are certainly very much looking forward to working with you on the Watersheds project and also to supporting you and the European Commission's leadership on rivers worldwide. Thank you for your leadership and thank you for this exciting commitment as well. I would also like now to hand over to my colleague, Ian Harrison, freshwater specialist at Conservation International. And Ian, my question for you is if you can tell us a bit about the new freshwater challenge on restoration and what is the role of Conservation International in this work? Ian, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so Conservation International's commitment to the Water Action Agenda is to support, as you mentioned, the Freshwater Challenge. It's a country-led initiative which aims to restore 300,000 kilometers of rivers and 350 million hectares of inland waters by 2030. And so we can help by collaborating with our partners in the countries where we work to identify freshwater areas that are priorities for ecosystem restoration and protection, such as areas that are at the intersection of high biodiversity value and ecosystem services and cultural value, cultural diversity. And we'll do the science that can identify and assess these priority areas. We'll assimilate freshwater and riparian data and develop analytical tools to help assess the condition of these watersheds. The kind of work that Musonda had mentioned previously. Our objectives are to conduct studies that apply top-down and bottom-up approaches, and to have products that are appropriately scaled to be useful and to inform decision-making in the places where they're needed. And the outputs of this will be directly relevant to several of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, the ones that were mentioned previously by Henk and Wataru. That includes Target 1 on ensuring that all areas that are under an integrated biodiversity inclusive spatial planning process, and especially Target 2 on ensuring that at least 30% of the areas of degraded inland water ecosystems are under effective restoration. Target 3, ensuring that 30% of inland waters are effectively conserved through protections. And for both Targets 2 and 3, it's going to be extremely important that they're not lumped in as a portion of terrestrial ecosystems, but they're in that 30% objective, they're done separately. And finally, Target 11, to restore and maintain and enhance nature's contributions to people through nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Ian, thank you so much. The Freshwater Challenge is certainly extremely exciting, and we thank you for your leadership in it. We look forward to working with you and supporting you on this as well. And I think in our next round of questions, we'll get back to a little bit more specifically on how that challenge can help countries meet some of the goals in the biodiversity framework and the national biodiversity plans of countries. First, though, I will ask our final panelists her first question. So over to Priyanka. And Priyanka is joining us as the communications coordinator, Priyanka Pandey, apologies, the communications coordinator of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, the chapter in Nepal. Priyanka, a very special welcome to you to our panel. And I noted when I went through the Water Action Agenda, there are more than 800 commitments, and several hundred of them involve or mention youth in some way. Priyanka, what can you tell us about some of those commitments, and why is it so important to involve youth in the biodiversity and water agendas?
Thank you, Liz. First of all, it was really exciting for me to look at the Water Action Agenda because when I was in Montreal for Global Biodiversity Framework, there was a conversation that is this agreement going to ever turn into action, and are youth ever going to be involved? That was a big question mark for us. But when I checked the Water Action Agenda recently, there are almost like 500 agendas with youth somewhere in the action agenda, and that was very interesting for me. Of course, I cannot elaborate on each one of them, so I have selected top 3 that are like replicable for my context here in Kathmandu, Nepal, and also stand out to me. Of course, there are amazing agendas, amazing commitments made for in regards with youth, and I hope they really turn into action. The first agenda that stood out to me is from Sustainable Green Initiatives Forum, and they make a commitment to make micro entrepreneurs with 10,000 youth and women farmers by 2030, and to conserve 60 million liters of water per annum, which will be benefited to 1 million farmers. And how they plan to do this is, instead of rainwater harvesting and storage, they're focusing on rainwater harvesting in recharging groundwater. And that technology is especially interesting to me because I live in a city, Kathmandu, where 70% of water flow is covered by groundwater, which is not at all sustainable. And they're planning to do this in Bangladesh, Ghana, India, Rwanda, and Vietnam. And if it allows, in fact, I have one groundwater recharge point in my own home. So if this is replicable in terms of the city, and if we can do something like this, train youth in this sector and then mobilize them in enhancing this project, that could be a really great initiative. I actually got to learn a lot from this one. The second one that was very interesting and stood out to me was from Swiss Water Partnership Youth. Oftentimes when we're talking about youth, it's always, we are not represented enough. We do not have the space to put our voices. And what they are targeting is, by 2030, they want 30% of their stakeholders in international forums, all sectors and stakeholders of water to be youth below 30 years old. That is a very ambitious target, but also very impressive. And especially as someone from Global South, it would be, and it's being done in Switzerland, which is in Global North, but still commendable. And if it could be replicated in Global South at that scale, our representation would be so much more easier, and we could come to forums and talk about these water action agendas much more easily. So this is definitely something when I talk, I'm in conversation with my government for NBSAPs and these processes. So this is something I'll definitely love to communicate with them and see if there's anywhere we can reach in this regard. So that is very interesting to me. Third one is youth water resource capacity expansion activities and future projections in the face of the planet's triple crisis. It is done by UNISC International. And what they do is they form a group called Kanikyo Cafe. And this is an exchange opportunity for young people to sit down with experts like the ones we have in our panels and youths, where experts can share their experiences, and a young researcher or a professional like me or anyone could share their queries and how they can build water projects. So that was very interesting to me. It is being done in Asia and Africa region. It is also intended to be done in Nepal. So I would definitely love to contact this organization and see if we can do something about it. So these are some of the projects that have stood out to me in the water action agenda. Back to you, Liz.
Priyanka, thank you so much. And I love that new 30. It's a new target for 30%, under 30 by 30, which we can add to our 30 by 30 targets in general. But that's a fantastic ambition. And I also hope that we can use the webinar today for you and others to make these connections so that you can join forces on these commitments. So thank you also for raising that. Now, before we open up to questions from our audience, I do want to put each of you on the panel on the spot a bit and ask you each just one more set of questions. The question is, how are you personally going to ensure impact and measurability of the success of your commitment? So I will start again from the top, and Dagmar, you have the first response.
Difficult question, but I will try. Okay, so my personal commitment to the commitment of the EU is really that we are going to make sure that the experience that we have with the application of the integrated approach to water management and the nexus approach between water and biodiversity is also promoted and shared with the other countries. How we are going to do it? Well, we will make sure, Liz, that we work together really well on the project that we are preparing, and that we will really share both good lessons learned, bad lessons learned, what we should avoid too. And I think that we have really a very good objective, because with this integrated approach and by restoring rivers and lakes to near natural conditions, we will enable the proper functioning of natural processes, regulating the hydrology of a river, the migration of species, and the transport of sediments. So there are many, many benefits that we can achieve together. On the monitoring and how we make sure that we are aware of the success or that we are lagging behind, well, we have certain mechanisms how to follow this. So within the EU, we have river basin management plans that the member states have to prepare and submit to the European Commission. So we evaluate them and we track progress. So what is the status of our water bodies in Europe? If they are healthy, if they are not, what kind of measures we need to put in place in order to achieve the target. So when I apply it again to the project that we are going to implement, I'm sure that we will be talking also about how we can support the countries to achieve the objective of the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. I have no doubt that you will succeed in that personal ambition. And I love the fact that you talk about sharing not only what works, but what doesn't work. We also need to be able to say these are the successes and the failures so that we can learn from them. Thank you so much for that explanation of your commitment. And I would now like to hand over to Mr. Ian Harrison to ask the same question. Ian, how will you personally ensure impact and measurability of the success of your commitment? And can you just say something briefly about how this will link to the national biodiversity strategies and plans, the NBSAPs, that countries will be putting into place for the global biodiversity framework? Over to you, Ian.
Sure, thank you. So CI's commitment is, we set up an objective of helping mobilize restoration in areas where CI works for the challenge for a subset of that, for an estimated 3,000 kilometers of rivers and 350,000 hectares of wetlands by 2030. And this is based on looking at where the size of the basins where we're working now and where we believe we can have influence. Now, in the immediate term, our commitment is linked to the objectives of many partners, particularly TNC, WWF, Wetlands International, who've been looking at how we can develop the right, as I mentioned before, the right guidelines based on the right data, science, and tools to define the existing extent and status of inland waters, the extent of the protection, and where there are priorities for action. And for example, there are things like WWF's work on the global extent of free-flowing rivers and IUCN's almost complete global assessment of freshwater fauna that can identify areas of freshwater biodiversity richness and threat. And that will be very important for informing how the Global Biodiversity Trust Fund is mobilized, I think. So how does this make specific impact on the ground beyond that? To me, that seems to be, as you alluded, to be focused on how the principles of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets get most effectively translated into area-specific action plans like the MBSAPs that can achieve measurable success. In that respect, I think that various NGOs can give guidance to their in-country partners on the criteria for where to focus work and how to measure that success. And we can measure a spatial extent of success of restoration and conservation through indicators like the Wetlands Extent Trends Index, the Connectivity Status Index for rivers. And besides protected areas, freshwater key biodiversity areas can give measures of existing and needed freshwater protection for MBSAPs. Measuring ecosystem condition and management effectiveness is going to be harder. We have things like the Citizen Science State of the World's Wetlands Survey, and that's been discussed for measuring ecosystem condition for Target 2. And for management, well, there's Ramsar has management tools. I always recommend the Freshwater Health Index co-developed by CI because it assesses the overall health of a watershed, making the connection between the ecosystem, its governance, and the benefits it provides to people through multiple stakeholder consultation. And just finally, an important question that's come up in these discussions for targets 2 and 3 has been how we decide on what we define as restored or protected freshwater. Restored or protected to what objective? Is it for biodiversity or for the provision of services or for the optimum combination of these things? And I think this whole process has forced us to think really practically about our restoration and protection objectives. So, thanks.
Ian, thank you so much for that. And, they say that the devil is in the details, and we do very much look forward to working together with you and the partners you've mentioned to help get proper measurable indicators around the global biodiversity framework, and also look at updating SDG target 666, which we know is also due for a revisit now that the biodiversity framework is put into place. So we're very much looking forward to helping build on those indices that you've mentioned, and to have proper measurement of success for these targets. Thank you so much for your intervention and for your work. I would also now like to ask Priyanka one final question from me before we open up to the floor. And that is for you, Priyanka. You mentioned very rightly so that youth need to be authentically engaged from an early stage in order to really provide action and get them involved in the future that will affect them. And one thing I would love to ask you is, how do you feel youth can be mobilized on the ground in order to make real change happen for the Water Action Agenda and the Global Biodiversity Framework? Priyanka, you have about 1 minute to respond.
Okay, I'll make it very short. One of the things I've noticed, whether it's climate financing or global biodiversity framework, I think we are all aware that there's no direct financial mechanisms for young people, women groups, and indigenous groups. And while that may not be a problem in other parts of the world, in Global South, a lot of these groups are not registered as organizations, which makes it very difficult for the bottom-up approach to be streamlined in this case. So it is very important to strengthen the financial mechanism. And I say this from experience because in Nepal, even in my hometown back in the hills, now we're facing outward migration. And as a result of that, we're going through human-wildlife conflict. And what is the cause? Because the cause is we as institutions are going down to the local people and telling this is what we need to do, but there's no agency or no financial mechanism for young people to sort of take up their own projects, develop entrepreneurships in their own local places. So they have to move and migrate to other places. And one of a very good example that I saw last week was Global Water Partnership is doing a South Asian Youth Water Challenge. So that selects youth and selects the youth projects and funds them to start in the local level. So as institutions, even though there are not like existing financial mechanisms to ensure this, maybe institutions have the power to translate this in other forms and allow this bottom-up approach to truly happen so that young people can actually turn agreement into action and instead of me going and telling them what they need to do, they can have the financial security to understand this is the project we need to be doing, this is the problem in our society, and this is the projects we want to do for Water Action Agenda and Global Biodiversity Framework. That's
Priyanka,
it.
thank you so much. And you've raised a very important issue of the financing and involving most authentically the groups that are most impacted by decline in ecosystem health and biodiversity. Very, very thought-provoking responses from all of our panelists. And obviously our audience feels the same way because they put a lot of questions into the chat. So we are going to start to try to address some of them. And I thank very much my colleagues at UN Water and CPD who are behind the scenes and supplying some of these questions in our chat as well. One question I will take first in no particular order. We have someone named Irma Popovic-Dumovic, who is asked, what do you think about having a special convention on river conservation, specifically aimed at the conservation of free-flowing rivers? Excellent question. This seems like it might be best aimed at Ian or at Dagmar. So I will open up to ask either of you or both of you if you'd like to give a response on a potential river convention.
I will try, if I may. So we have already one water convention that is already in place. So I think that we have already a mechanism and a framework under which we could potentially explore how to also address the free-flowing rivers as well. What I can say is that in the EU, you are probably aware that in June last year, we made a proposal of a new nature restoration law that once it is approved by the Council and the Parliament, and when it comes into force, it will have the objective also to make sure that we have free-flowing rivers in Europe. So to respond to the question, I think that this is an interesting idea, but I would recommend firstly to look into what already exists, how we can perhaps strengthen and improve it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dagmar. Would any other panelists like to respond on that question?
I mean, I'll just agree with what Dagmar says. I think we focus in on the capacity and that we have in existing conventions and really work hard at that. Free-flowing rivers are extremely important, and I think I certainly agree on that point. Yeah, let's use the capacity that has been developed.
Thank you so much, Ian and Dagmar, for those responses. I have another question that may be directed at Ian. You'll let me know, Ian, if you feel confident to take it on. This question is coming from Neil Cox, and the question is, are there other means of identifying and cataloging sites that are of critical importance for highly threatened freshwater species, apart from Ramsar? Ian, what do you think?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned in one of my responses, we have freshwater key biodiversity areas which are being identified based on IUCN data assessments for species, and that KBA process for freshwaters is also it integrates in stakeholder review of the regions and the process, and so it kind of addresses aspects of efficiency of management. And I think that those freshwater KPAs are going to be extremely important, and will obviously link to existing protected areas, Ramsar sites, and build on them, integrate with them.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thanks for that. And if any of the panelists would also like to drop any links to more information in the chat, if there's any references you'd like to share, please do so. Any frameworks you'd like us to look at, or articles with more information, we welcome that as well. I do have another question now that I believe may be well answered by our youth specialist, Priyanka. Priyanka, you can let me know. This question comes from Zanar Kolzanova. And Zanar is asking or saying that there is a discrepancy between what governments are committing to at the UN and international conferences and what is actually happening on the ground in their countries. What can we do about this issue? Priyanka, do you have any thoughts about this?
This is definitely true, even for my country. A lot of commitments are made, and we have a very unstable government. So what happens is governments go and commit for things, and by the time they're back here, the people in the power positions change. But I think definitely as young people, we have the power to make our voices strong. You can definitely join the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, and we're almost all around the globe with more than 40 chapters. And we definitely have prepared tools and advocacy materials for how to reach the government. In terms of Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD usually has a focal point back in your country. You can connect to them. You can ask them to be accountable. That is an agency, that is an international agency you can use to connect with your government and talk about these issues and make them accountable. As young people, basically advocating for why things are not going the way they should is definitely the way to go. Definitely connect with our Global Youth Biodiversity Network chapter in your country, or just with our global network. And there's much more resources we can share in this regard.
Priyanka, thank you so much. You've given us some great suggestions for what we can do locally in our country. If you'll accept me as a youth, I would love to join your network. I might not qualify, so I invite all of those who may identify as youth to do so. It's a fantastic network that you're involved in. Also, for noting that CBD has national chapters and ways to get involved there. The best thing I think we can all do is to take action and care ourselves and do something in our own countries. So thank you for bringing in those great suggestions. And thank you to the question also from Zanar. I have a question now from Talita Pinotti to all speakers on the panel. The question is, the water biodiversity nexus still lags behind in terms of overall public awareness and resource mobilization. How can capacity building help in tackling this challenge? Anyone in the panel who would like to start, please do so.
I can start again. I think that we can respond here with the project that we are preparing with UNEP, because with this project, we believe we are going really to address better awareness of the linkages between water and biodiversity. We will be working together with different stakeholders, and we will really try to promote this integrated approach to water management and biodiversity protection.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. I will now love to ask either Ian or Priyanka if you have thoughts on capacity building to raise awareness around these links between water and biodiversity.
Okay, I can go ahead. So basically, what I notice in urban population is that water is just connected to drinking. From an urban scope of looking at things. Sometimes it's disconnected from how the food comes to our plate. It comes from water and biodiversity and agriculture, and these all steps are missed in this process. So it's definitely important. One of our components from, again, Global Youth Biodiversity Network is we work on transformative education, which means we include these these primary ideas on biodiversity in syllabuses and focus on educating children and youth. And we do a lot of advocacy trainings in terms of, and this is how capacity building can kind of connect the gap that's there between water, biodiversity, and access. Another thing I also really love is, I think it was by UN Water, I don't know if this is visible, there's a water challenge badge book that I use. These are amazing challenges. When you are capacity building with students and children, it is very important to talk in their language, and building materials like this and using these resources can be very helpful in educating this sort of educating and sharing this sort of knowledge with youth and young people and children and everyone in general.
Priyanka, you made me very happy showing that water challenge badge. I remember working on it with Yunga maybe 10 years ago. I hope it's been updated since then, but that's fantastic that it is in use and that it is useful for young people to get them excited and learn more about water. I'm just going to take one final question, and this can be for anyone on the panel who'd like to respond before we close up for the webinar today. We have so many great questions that are in the chat. I want to thank everyone for all of your questions. We've got quite a few questions that are about water pollution and water quality. As someone is asking about toxic conditions in our water ecosystems. Others are talking about chemical pollution, transnational cooperation, waste, agricultural production that is threatening our rivers, oceans, human health, and wildlife. Would somebody on the panel like to just quickly address the issue of water pollution linked to agricultural, also economic growth, and how can we tackle this, this problem? I open up to you.
I can again start very briefly. I think it is again about this integrated approach to water management, and what is important is really to have the right legal framework in place that addresses really the interlinkages between pollution and those who pollute the waters, and the linkage between the measures that need to be put in place in order to protect our waters, our water bodies. So again, I would refer to the experience that we have in the EU with the Water Framework Directive, where we are looking really at the pressures on the water bodies, on fresh water, and then we identify what kind of measures we need to introduce. And this is all done together with all the stakeholders and also the users of the water and those who pollute it. So I would stop here. I dropped the line in the chat with some more information about the EU actions on water. So if anybody also have any question, I am happy to respond after this webinar. Thank you.
Dagmar, thank you so much also for sharing those links. And again, to all of our panelists and opening speakers, I welcome you to share information so that we can learn more about how we can get involved. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of this hour. I think we could have used several more, and I hope this is just the beginning of our conversation together. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd particularly like to thank all of my colleagues at UN Water, in particular Chung Lee and Sarah Breslin, and at CBD, Monica Kobayashi, Chris Pereira, and all of your teams for their fantastic support to make this webinar happen today. And we'd like to urge all of you to stay in touch with us on one of our social media channels. I'm sure those are finding their way into our chat, LinkedIn or Twitter. Those who are on the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration site, please join Generation Restoration, learn about the Freshwater Challenge, learn about the Youth Network, learn about your CBD focal points in your country, and do get involved. And for those who will be at the HLPF in New York in July, please check out, either in person or via webcast, our SDG 6 and Water Action Agenda special event on July 17th. And finally, do check out and share the amazing assets that CBD has created for International Day of Biodiversity. And for those who weren't able to attend in person today or joined late or had any difficulties in the call, we've also recorded today's session for you. Take care, all the best, stay in touch, and thank you for joining us today. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Liz. Bye.
so much. Bye-bye.
Sorry, I think we just have some closing remarks coming from Madhu.
Oh, my apologies, Madhu.
No,
Did not mean to
that's
end
quite
before you.
okay. I think people are leaving, so that's fine. Not a
Sorry.
problem at all. Not a problem at all.